No, cut the intro. So, normally I put one of the stranger old video game adverts before the start. Well, this time I found just the strangest one yet. When you remember that this was supposed to sell things and was decided as a good idea by a board of people, it baffles the mind. I can't show you the full thing, it's 6 minutes long, but here's the best bits. Enjoy what happens when Sony and Namco join up to make commercials.
And now a real Japanese guy from a really big Japanese company in Japan.
こんにちは。私は本物の日本人なんですけれども、今日は去る日本の大企業から参りました。そしてこれがプレイステーションです。ところでソニーほどの会社がプレイステーションの発売にあたって本当に何百万ドルのものお金を使うとお思いになりますか？しかもこんなサックなゲームにサクビクタイム。嫌です。ホーミー。母親は悪い子は決して褒めません。ちょっと誰か日レーサーのビデオお願い。おお、本当に素晴らしいゲームですよね。痛いですね。バババババババ、緊急事態バババババババババ。あ、失礼いたしました。ちょっと昔の悪い癖が出てしまいました。あ、なんだそこにいたんですか。どうやら CM の時間のようですからトイレに行くにはちょうどいいですよ。私は腰布一枚だけをつけた野蛮人たちが繰り広げる戦いを存分に楽しみたいと思います。おい早く俺を上に投げろスコッティ。あ、彼はもう死んでるよジーム。ダメ、僕は医者だ。レンガ職人じゃないんだ。僕は何を言ってるんだろう。
1992. The future had arrived. CD-based console gaming was here. The Sega CD had just hit the market, and the Philips CDI was attempting to be a console, but the main event was yet to arrive. The Super Nintendo CD and the PlayStation. With three companies banding together to make these, it wouldn't be long now, right? Well, it would be a lie to say the relationship between Nintendo, Philips and Sony were at their best right now. At that point in time, Nintendo was actually suing Sony for trying to use the name PlayStation, which they claimed they owned. Let's have a quick recap as to why all this was happening. Nintendo and Sony were making a Super Nintendo CD drive, which eventually evolved into making the Nintendo PlayStation. Things went well, until Sony went behind Nintendo's back so that only they could make substantial profit from it. Instead of talking to Sony, Nintendo then went behind their back and hired their biggest rival, Philips, to make the Super Nintendo CD drive instead. Part of the deal allowed Philips to use Nintendo characters on their CDI console. The CDI console was awful. Sony now had to continue without Nintendo's help on the PlayStation, eventually breaking all ties with them. Nintendo wasn't fond of Philips because of how disastrous their console was, but was still hoping a Super Nintendo CD could be made. And now...
the thrilling conclusion!
You know, Nintendo were viewed as jerks back in the day. Apart from the consumer, everyone, and I mean everyone, hated them. While they loved and admired them for bringing back the games industry, the practices Nintendo was employing were a little to be desired. Say you're a game developer, and you want to make a game for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Okay, well that's great! Apart from the fact you need to get permission from Nintendo to do so. Nintendo's lockout chip was developed to stop piracy and shovelware in hopes of avoiding another video game crash. Whilst it did indeed work, their restrictions were perhaps too strict. It meant only they could produce the cartridges,
So to make your game, you must first...
buy a development kit from Nintendo, sign all kinds of deals with Nintendo to get your game sold and approved, buy every single one of the cartridges off Nintendo to then sell it to shops, try and pitch your game to consumers to make money, and money you do make, the majority of it goes back to Nintendo because you use their tools, their console, and their cartridges to make it. Any profits you did get was measly compared to what the Big N got. So back when Sony got the bright idea to word their contract in a certain way so they made the most money, is it any real surprise that they did? They wanted to enter the game market, they couldn't do that with the measly profit they'd get. They'd even tried approaching a deal beforehand but had been turned down. Now I'm not saying what Sony did nor what Nintendo did is good or bad. It's business after all. If you've got a great product, you're going to want to get lots and lots of profit. But I think it does show that frankly, neither of these guys are the good or bad guy. Anyway... The final chapter into the origins of this rivalry begins with a group of executives from Nintendo's largest licenses meeting with Hiroshi Yamauchi, the head of Nintendo, in October 1992. The reason was quite simple. Various gaming publishers were sick to death of all the different CD formats, meaning porting games to different systems was a pain. Now, because Nintendo and Sony were both making new CD platforms, they decided they needed to do something about it before it was too late, and they had another set of CDs. So basically, they practically demanded that Nintendo, Sony, and Philips work out their differences. Not having much choice, the three companies met once again. Well, it turns out some rather interesting revelations came out at this meeting. Turns out Nintendo wasn't the first to give Philips a hand with the CDI. Sony had in fact worked with Philips way back during the very early days of CDI development to make the console together by creating the format of CD that the console would go on to use. The two swiftly began disagreeing with each other and fell out, meaning Sony then went to Nintendo after, only for Nintendo to then go after Philips. The entire fiasco had come full circle. Eventually these three came to an agreement. All companies would create software that used the same format of CD worldwide. Nintendo and Sony also had a bit of a heart-to-heart to work out their differences. Sony even came out and admitted that they needed to ally with them since Nintendo was clearly the 16-bit console winner. With the reunion, it was decided that now Nintendo, Philips, and Sony were all going to make the Super Nintendo CD drive together and boost it up to a 32-bit machine to beat out the 16-bit competitors. Nintendo got back the right to control all licenses for games on the PlayStation and the SNES CD, while Sony got the license all non-game stuff for the system, stuff like edutainment and movies. And Philips, well, they got, I'm sure there's something here. Well, Philips, yeah, they got... Moving on! So, while this all sounds all good and dandy, things have a habit of going wrong when it comes to these three. For instance, Nintendo had begun to lose all interest in even making a Super Nintendo CD drive. Technically, it could now be done very quickly and released, but the Super Nintendo on its own with just the cartridges was doing just fine, raking in the millions for Nintendo. Plus, if they took a look at how the market was responding to, say, Sega's Mega CD, it wasn't good news. In fact, Nintendo was practically ignoring the project themselves now, leaving the others to make it. They were far more interested in just updating the Super Nintendo without add-ons. 2 months earlier, in August 1992, Nintendo revealed the Super FX chip. This was packaged inside the cartridges, so people didn't have to go out and buy something extra. For those of you not in the know, the Super FX chip allowed for basic 3D graphics, which for the time was pretty damn revolutionary. This included games like Star Fox and Stunt Race FX. It also helped out in scaling with 2D games like Yoshi's Island, meaning that the console could scale enemies that were tiny into huge ones. There was even a sequel to the chip, though not many games use it. Star Fox 2 was going to use that, but it was cancelled. Guess we're going to have to revisit that. Basically, the point is the Super FX was pretty damn amazing. And now, the CD drive and the PlayStation would need to be much better to sell it to consumers. After all, if you can get the game quality without buying the expensive add-on or a whole new console, then what's the point? And so for 7 months, Nintendo, Sony and Philips fell completely silent on the projects. In May 1993, Nintendo finally spoke about the Super Nintendo CD project, and gave a release date of autumn 1994, with a price of about $200. Supposedly, they already had a Zelda and a Street Fighter being made for it, and they promised the CD drive's final design would be shown at CEX in a few months. They lied. Instead, Super Mario All-Stars got shown off, alongside some other Super FX games. So where did the Super Nintendo CD go? Well, the answer is quite simple. The future had arrived, but now it had become the past. Why work on a 32-bit console when it was clear nobody cared about it? Nintendo had proven 16 bits was still profitable with games like Donkey Kong Country, which was released as a direct response to 32-bit contenders, and had sold out everywhere. No, what they needed was something bigger and more impressive. Something to wow people, not something similar to their competitors like Sony and Philips' 32-bit machines. They needed the power of both these consoles combined. They needed 64 bits. Enter the Nintendo, or rather, the Ultra 64, as it was called at the time. Nintendo had set up a new partnership with Silicon Graphics to make 3D 64-bit games. With this in place, and seeing how promising early tests were, releasing a Super Nintendo add-on would be obsolete. Otherwise, it would be like adding on a life support machine to a console that was in its later years. In many ways, Sega did the exact opposite. So the Super Nintendo CD came to an end, and apparently never made it past prototype stage, nor did any of the software. But, more importantly, what happened to the PlayStation? After all the extra development time, it had pretty much been completed. Yeah, that's right, finished, ready to go and ship out the door. There was a grand total of 200 already made. While after Nintendo stopped the Super Nintendo CD, it was clear that the PlayStation was going to be next. Not wanting to go through that whole fiasco again, Sony abandoned the PlayStation. Or did they? Turns out Sony snuck away with the PlayStation technology both they and Nintendo were working on, and began working it into a system of their own. First of all, they were sick of Nintendo, and with the partnership now fully terminated, they removed the ability to play Super Nintendo games on the system before anything else. Then they decided it was
Time for a little payback!
And then set to work reworking everything to make it a contender against the Nintendo 64. They might not be able to get the 64 bits Nintendo had, but they were determined to steal the market from under them, with high quality games and stealing some exclusives for their own. Not only that, but they already owned a near complete console already. They could beat everyone else to the market. You can probably imagine the reaction Nintendo had when a few months later Sony stepped out of the shadows to reveal their plans. That's right folks, it's lawsuit time! And how did they do it? Well, they tried the exact same method of course, claiming that they owned the name to the PlayStation. It didn't work the first time, it didn't work the second. In fact, Sony went out of its way to agree to change the name, only to then simply remove the space between the words, almost as a final kick in the teeth to Nintendo. And thus Sony planned to release its very first console, and oh boy, was the gaming world in a frightened panic. Sony was essentially releasing a Nintendo console as their own, and Nintendo had always been the top dogs. This could change everything. Admittedly, Sony claimed they'd reworked the entire system and wasn't anything like the Nintendo version, but I kinda doubt that myself, given the time span. Either way, Sony had learned straight from the best, and now every company was in fear. Sega panicked so much that they made a surprise announcement on May 11th, 1995, at the very first E3, that instead of the original September release date for the Sega Saturn, it was going on sale right then, right now, which meant half the retailers didn't have any stock. Those that didn't felt outraged and refused to stock the system throughout its entire lifetime, and those that did have the system didn't have enough. Atari, on the other hand, tried to big up their console to beat Sony, claiming that the Jaguar was in fact the first 64-bit console, when in reality it was a 32-bit graphics system and another 32-bit sound system stuck together. Nintendo, well, not wanting to lose any of their customers, announced none other than the Virtual Boy at the same E3, because there was already tons of delays to the Nintendo 64. And it was not just 32 bits like the PlayStation, but portable too. But I think we know how that turned out. With Sega in a right state and Sony still annoyed at Nintendo, the true rivalry commenced. Nintendo had stuck with cartridges, meaning they kept the old licensing agreements, but had far bigger space and faster than the CDs. They mocked Sony with this with various ad campaigns. Sony, on the other hand, retaliated with ad campaigns of their own. At one point, they got a guy dressed as Crash Bandicoot drive up to Nintendo of America HQ and begin taunting Nintendo down a microphone, while showing off the PlayStation at the same time.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here.
Check it out. What do you think about that? We got real-time, 3D, lush organic environments. How's that make you feel, buddy?
Feel a little like your days are numbered?
I'm gonna have to ask you to leave.
You're hurting my elbow.
Is that Italian?
No, Bandicoot, it's an Australian name.
Nintendo remained confident in their system. That was until the sales started. The PS1 was a gigantic hit, the first console to ship over 100 million systems worldwide. Nintendo wasn't out though. It still had several great first-party hits and constantly kept on. But for the first time ever, they were always in second place. Even to game makers themselves, it's a well-known tale of how Final Fantasy left Nintendo consoles for PlayStation since Nintendo insisted on keeping on cartridges, which by now were very expensive to make. Nintendo even tried to gain some support back with the 64 disc drive, which was similar to the Super Nintendo CD and was actually released too. Only to flop because CD gaming was cheaper everywhere else. And at the end of it all, gaming would never be the same again. Who knows what would have happened if Nintendo had stuck to its guns and continued working with Sony? I expect honestly, not much. Sony would have always eventually left to make their own console, just maybe a few years later and under a different name. In fact, I expect they still would have beaten the Nintendo 64, and the PlayStation would have been just one of those forgotten systems, while the new Sony console stole the limelight. The only change may have been the friendly relationships between the two companies, and who knows, maybe we would have seen Ratchet and Clank and Smash Bros. But at the end of it all, these two were always destined to be rivals. Wow, so that was the origin of Nintendo vs Sony. Pretty exciting stuff, right? Well, that's nothing compared to the console war a few years prior. After all, both companies came out okay, right? Unlike the slow, painful death of the last company to challenge Nintendo. I mean, what's the point of a good war without a fatality in there somewhere? Hey, thanks for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed this very slowly released trilogy. Don't worry, new episodes should be coming out far more frequently from now on, for at least a few months. I recommend following me on Twitter if you want to get regular updates on new videos, and don't forget to leave a like or a comment, and subscribe as well, I'd really appreciate it if you did. If you can't wait for my next video, go check out some of my other ones, like my show Memory Card, where we go over forgotten gaming trivia, or catch up on the previous episode of From Concept to Console. I'll see you guys next time.